When does suicide become a way that we think about coping with painful things? Well, it happens in youth.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Suicides and suicide attempts peak in spring and early summer. But research shows that the ideation and the mental health issues that precede the acts are at their worst now, in the winter. My guest to discuss what you can do to help kids who may be having suicidal thoughts is Carla Allan. Carla is the chief of the Division of Psychology at Phoenix Children's Hospital, and her insights on this topic are both professional and deeply personal. This episode was intentionally produced to support the formation and coordination of adolescent-centered care and services. So you also will hear from Beheir Thompson and Vinny Chulani of the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. It was recorded live using a webinar platform to encourage questions from Alliance members and other listeners. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I think that we all have a responsibility to understand and be able to help move people away from suicidality. So it's been a long-standing professional interest, but it became personal for me too. I think, Brad, as you may know, in 2018, I lost my sister to suicide, unfortunately, while she was under direct care of mental health professionals in a hospital setting in the midst of a suicidal crisis. And so it was an incredibly tragic experience that really caused me to dig deep and look at not only the opportunities perhaps I might have had for her as a loved one, things that I wished I could do differently that I, of course, cannot, but it caused me to look even more broadly at what are we doing as professionals? How competent are we in this thing that I honestly think we know through research that many people experience suicidal thoughts from time to time. I think it's a part of the human condition for many, and yet not everybody feels comfortable and competent in being able to discuss that. And so it became a life's mission for me to figure out how to address that gap, both within our own internal hospital settings, but maybe more importantly, in the places where kids interact with people who can help. And most of the time that's in pediatric offices. They're not connected yet to mental health people. And so if I just looked at that tiny slice of the pie, although it's so important, it's not enough. Mm-hmm. And so we've been really laser focused on developing better systems, both throughout our hospital system, but hopefully throughout the entire state eventually.
You know, and there's so much in what you just said, and I want to unpack that. But before I do, and maybe, you know, Vinny and Beheir, you can address this question as well. Why are we talking about it in 2024 particularly?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to give a little slice of that.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, yes. Vinny and I wear somewhat different but complementary hats, right? I think it's been out in the media, and people probably know that deaths by suicide are increasing dramatically, both in youth, but across the entire lifespan. We kind of call them deaths of despair, right? And I think what this captures about this particular time in life is that it's stressful. You know, coming on the heels of the pandemic, the way that we connect with others, how we feel in our community, so many things were truly rocked, especially for young kids. It has been the case that for the last, 10 plus years, Deaths by suicide have been increasing year over year over year. I like to start out really first by saying there are reasons for hope. So I'm going to talk about some stats here that are scary, but gosh darn it, we in medicine do all kinds of miraculous things all the time when we put our heads together. And so I don't want anyone to be worried about what I'm about to say because there are brilliant people working on it. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about people beyond me. But we can take what they learn and put it to practice, right? Yeah. So, suicide has become, the second or even third leading cause of death for kids that are in the age range that we see here at Phoenix Children's. Right. And that has, of course, going to move people to want to do something different. It's true that the most recent data that we have, those rates seem to be a little bit more stable for youth, but for adults, it continues to get worse. And the thing I want to highlight here is that when does suicide become a way that we think about coping with painful things? Well, it happens in youth. That sort of way of thinking, it takes root then. And we can do something about that as long as we are brave and courageous and we lean in and we talk to people during their time of need. That reduces stigma, which is so incredibly important. Vinny, I know you know a lot about this too because you see it in your practice. I'm going to invite you to say a few more things from the pediatric perspective.
Yeah, I think this is especially an important discussion, Brad, given that the American Academy of Pediatrics, in partnership with public health organizations, really recognize that we're in the middle of a public health emergency with youth mental health. And like Carla had talked about, just statistics and numbers of all adolescent deaths, 1 in 4, 25% is by suicide. So we are losing so many young lives of promise, and if we could just get them past that point to suicide, and it's an important conversation for us to have.
Yeah, and if I may just add, I think the timing is everything there, right? So how do you get somebody before they die by suicide? The vast majority of time, they've thought about it for a long time, right? They've weighed on it, they've chewed on it, they've tried to figure out, how can I cope with this in a different way? And they've just come up short. And so part of this is by helping empower people with the evidence-based approach. How do you ask comfortably how you're actually thinking and feel? Are you thinking about killing yourself, right? We want to empower people to ask directly because that's how you find out, right? And then we want to encourage people to talk through the next steps in a way that's not stigmatizing. A good colleague of mine said this, and I think it's so beautiful. Sometimes kids need a hug, not a hospital, right? And so if we can catch kids earlier in that trajectory when they're marinating on it for the first time, well, then we can really do something there.
Wow. So, Beheir, working with adolescents as you do, when you hear Carla say the idea that suicide might be a solution to the pain that somebody's feeling, that those ideas form in adolescence, how do you feel about that? That must kind of hit you right in the gut.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we talk all the time about adolescents being that forgotten population. And a lot of times we don't dig deep into their vulnerability, right? Because we're so on the defense of their hormones and the things that we think we know about adolescents. And so I think it's really important for us to just lean into compassion, lean into kindness, and try to have that empathy for that age group.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing to that too, right? I think this is a critical part of this conversation. What does a suicidal adolescent look like? They look like everybody. They have moments of joy. If you're looking for a kid who's all depressed, you're going to miss a lot of kids who are struggling with whether or not life is worth living, which is why you got to be able to ask, right? You got to be able to ask directly and with compassion. I mean, that part of it is really huge.
Yeah. But to what you're saying here, Carla, just to push back for a second, we have people in our community that say that when you talk to adolescents about suicide, you might actually be giving them the idea. And I'm not, that is absolutely not my belief, but we all encounter those individuals in our communities What's your response to that? Because you just advocated for asking directly.
Mm-hmm. So I have two thoughts about it. One is that absolutely strikes me as wrong from my lived experience. Yeah. And it does because when it came to my sister, for example, and I had, she wrote a last note to us. And part of it talked about that it felt to her as though nobody was really asking how she was feeling for real. Okay, so that what she's really speaking to is misery. And what is the best way out of misery? It's having people company who are willing to walk along with you. And so there's that aspect. What does it feel like as a person? Does that ring true to me? No, it doesn't. The other is from the research perspective. We know through research that the way you save lives is asking. In fact, we do it about all kinds of other things. No one wrings their hands when they ask about, are you wearing a seatbelt? Are you, any other safety sort of behaviors, right? We know to ask, and we understand that saves lives. This shouldn't be any different just because it's an issue that has a historical, moral sort of compass to it, right? Think about the language with suicide. Someone committed suicide as though it's a crime. It lives in this dark corner of the world that it just doesn't need to. This is a human experience that I think we need to normalize that part of it. I do.
Well, I mean, not to be snarky about it, but it has been a crime. We've actually made it illegal in different societies and different states over time. Like, what's the punishment if you commit that crime? But to your point, one of the things that I think, is absolutely in the research, and Beheir, I know that you encountered this too, is in the process of asking, you're allowing that person to recognize that they're having a feeling that they think is unique, that nobody else has had that or experienced that before. You've encountered that, I'm sure, Beheir.
For sure. Everybody thinks that they're the only one, right? Going through what they're going through. And that's what I meant about leaning into that vulnerability, is the more we connect, the more we open up and talk about these things, we'll realize this is a part of the human condition.
And I think, so Carla, for the people watching, because it's this interesting thing, pain is individual. We don't actually know what another person is feeling, and we can't. So asking them about their feelings, about their suicidality, that both acknowledges that they might be experiencing it, that it might not be a feeling that they themselves are the only one that's ever had it, while acknowledging that their own pain, their own perspective is unique. Do you have tips for that conversation and language to use?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really key points. So, and I do really want to make sure that this message is heard loud and clear too. While the suicide rates are increasing, it's also true that at the population level, it's a pretty rare event. The broader event that I think, again, to kind of redirect us back to, is that experience of suicidality and the thoughts around suicide. That is something the vast majority of people will have in life, and the vast majority of people grow from those experiences. Mm-hmm. They grow beyond them. They may lead richer, more meaningful lives on the other side of that. But when you're a kid, you don't know that yet, right? Your back's against the wall. Maybe something has happened with your friends or family. You're worried you're going to disappoint people. There's some shame. And so I think part of how you do this is you ask when someone, and you ask directly about suicidality. When someone says, yeah, I do sometimes think about it, we don't then run away. We don't try to problem solve right away, right? Tell me more about that, right? There are ways that we can better understand their unique drivers, and they are unique to the individual, right? But it's also true that there are these really beautiful patterns, and I call them beautiful because they make sense, right? That if you are feeling like a burden to people, you feel like you don't belong to people, you've suffered from chronic pain and you're just exhausted, there's some reliable themes that kind of underlie a lot of this. And the reason I point out that it's unique and yet there's a pattern then we can help people understand. We know how to help, right? The
Right.
field understands this, and we can help guide you back out of it. So I guess I'm saying you both focus on the broader themes, but more importantly, how that shows up for that individual.
You've addressed so many of these myths that surround suicide already. This idea that there are no warning signs. In reality, there are some things that we can look for. You've addressed the fact that a myth that I've been struggling with is that it's the result of the pandemic, the spike that we're seeing. And you've already pointed out that the trend precedes the pandemic. You've addressed the fact that it's not just an adolescent problem, but it's a societal one. In fact, people in the parent cohort of adolescents are struggling with it at far greater rates even than adolescents. So any other myths that you think the listeners should be aware of and maybe we want to debunk here?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a two-part one, complete opposite sides, which is incredibly dangerous. One is that suicides aren't preventable, right? Yeah. That was meant to, no, there really truly are. There are warning signs, there are opportunities to intervene. I think that's absolutely the case. And the other is that it's a moral flaw, or that it's the case that whoever does that, they're just selfish. It's the selfishness that's driving them towards suicidality. What we really know about, I kind of highlighted some of that earlier, in the mind of someone who's really considering that, in their own warped perspective, which is rooted in suicidality, which is not clear thinking, they think they're doing everyone a favor. That the cost of their life for those around them is much more if they continue down the road of living than it is if they just call it a day, right? It's about that feeling of being a burden. And so I think those are two incredible myths that we've got to change the language around. Yes, it's preventable, and no, it's not related to selfish thinking.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. You see those themes.
Vinny, something that you've done a lot to educate people about that I think is incredibly germane to this discussion is after we talk with the adolescent, with the youth about this issue, there's also this other thing that we have to navigate, which is their relationship with their primary care providers, with their parents or their guardians. Let's talk a little bit about once you have identified that there is a youth that needs extra care or extra services, particularly around suicidality, how do we then navigate that very treacherous area of the gap between them and their parents?
Yeah. So first of all, Brad, I acknowledge this when I meet with parents, that parents know their kids best, better than I know them. And oftentimes parents will actually bring their children in and bring up their concerns about their children's emotional health. When we talk with young people about how they're doing and conversations about suicidality come up, they're often in the context of a confidential conversation where everything we talk about is between us, not unless you might be a danger to yourself, a danger to another, or perhaps in an abusive situation. And that's really about our role as mandated reporters. When we identify a young person who is clearly either acutely or perhaps, at risk for suicide, it's really our responsibility to initiate those conversations with parents. And we're very frank, like, hey, we talked about at the beginning of our conversation that should this come up, it's our duty. And young people really are very receptive to that. They acknowledge that. Where sometimes it takes a little bit of finesse is when you work with a young person who is experiencing depressive symptoms or occasional thinking, but who's not at that acute level, who's not an acute threat to themselves, where you now have to break confidentiality and involve the parent. And it becomes a conversation, and you hear kids sort of perspective. Yeah, like if I bring it up, oftentimes when parents are first clued into their kids' behaviors, young people then feel like they're under a microscope and every behavior is being watched. Their parents become over vigilant. And I really kind of talk to young people about what their thoughts are about involving their parents. What are their barriers? What are their anticipated responses? While offering myself as a resource to them, and how young people do best when they're in sync, when they communicate, they're connected with their parents. And this is really about how you foster those supportive connections, which are oftentimes what young people really need to lift them out of those dark places.
Carla?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to it here. And I want to be really clear that A, I'm speaking to my lived experience of having lost a family member. Okay. And B, I'm going to speak to what that means, I think, sometimes for parents. So the hard thing is that someone who's really at risk, if you're close to them, you may be the last to know because they don't want to cause you pain. Okay? You may be the last to know. And that's why it takes a village. That's why we as a healthcare system have got to rally around the fact that part of this is our responsibility and shared responsibility with the family. B, as parents and as a parent too, I can tell you that our ears are not always ready to hear the fact that our kid is at risk. Right? I mean, it just goes against the very core of what our mission is as a parent, to grow our kids successfully. Like, it's hard for parents to understand. And so sometimes they're not always yet on board with A, believing you as a provider when you say that. B, it feels safer to try to say, oh, no, that's just because of this thing with this peer and it's not really a thing. Well, sometimes it very much is a thing. And so for me, in the role of working with parents, sometimes part of my job is a very matter-of-fact conversation that you can accept this and help us move in that direction by looking at the system in which they live in, or we can continue down the same path with the same behaviors, and why would we expect it to work out different? We've just found out that your kid's in misery, right? Like, it's not your fault, but you can be a part of the solution. And so I think it's really important to give tangible things that parents can do to that end. The very first thing that anybody should say when they worry that someone's at risk, even if it's not immediately imminent, let's make your home safer, right? We talk about means reduction. Why do we do that? Because especially in the adolescent brain, if you ask people who had an attempt, how long it took for them to think, I think I'm going to attempt, to doing, I'm going to make an attempt, it's usually 5 to 10 minutes. That's it. That's the short sort of span of a suicidal crisis. If we can keep people from accessing the very plan that they had thought of, we do know that's not a time for creative thinking. Most of the time, people don't substitute with another plan in that moment. What they do is they calm down and they live to see another day. So we need to make sure that medications, including over-the-counter medications, especially Tylenol and Advil, people think that those are harmless. We have big Costco-sized bottles throughout our house. We don't need that, right? They need to be secure because that is the most common way that adolescents might make an attempt. Lethal means. I am not anti-gun. I'm far from it. I come from a military family, but we need to be exquisitely safe with gun ownership, especially when we have adolescent brains in our homes. They need to be stored safely and securely. It is not a time where kids should be able to access that. We need to be curious and careful. Yeah, those are two big important things.
Yeah. But Brad, I want to go back to Carla's comment about the village. That village and the public health approach, there's a whole spectrum from general mental health promotion to prevention to treatment to recovery. And that village really has to go beyond healthcare systems. It has to extend to where young people interact with caring adults, coaches, schools, teachers. It really is about broadening that village so that we can better support young people.
There is a feeling among some people who work with youth that they don't want to be aware of a problem that they themselves can't fix. And, it's, I've heard it from many people in many different roles in a child's life. So for the people who are listening to this, where can they go to make sure that they're in a place to help an adolescent that is going through this, even if they aren't, even if that's not part of their professional job or their expertise or their training?
Well, I give a presentation about this, and the title of the presentation is Preventing Youth Suicide, Why You Don't Need to Be a Mental Health Expert to Help. And here's how, right? If you got ears, you've got one of the requirements.
Right.
It's compassionate listening, really.
Yeah.
That's huge. You want someone to feel seen and heard. That in and of itself helps reduce that sense of burdensomeness and increases the sense of social belongingness, which, by the way, is a modifiable risk factor, the most modifiable for suicide, right? If you can feel seen and that you belong and understood.
Yeah.
So there's that. At the same time, I recognize that sometimes you're going to interact with someone and you're like, holy shnikes, I feel like I'm in over my head. And I don't know if they're really at risk or not. And the great thing here, as a nation, we've got 988 as a crisis line that you can call both if you yourself are struggling. It's huge, but it also helps walk you through if you're worried for someone else, what you might need to do. And so that is a gift to have that as an option.
Beheir, you've been doing a lot of work understanding why youth don't access help for themselves or even for their peers. This conversation, this is making me think about some of the things that you've shared before. What else can you tell our listeners about why youth don't come to the caring adults in their lives?
Yeah, I think just going back to what we were talking about in the last episode about commercialism and marketing, we kind of fall into this thinking as adolescents that no one cares, that our adults in our lives don't have the time because either they're working on something or they're on their phones as well, busy, right? People are too busy to talk about these things, but also just the stigma that goes with admitting things about your mental health. Because again, if I'm thinking I'm the only one, who do I go to about this? And so although I speak to my stepson quite a bit, and he has a lot of traumatic situations that he goes through on a consistent basis with one of his parents, I keep the Teen Lifeline magnet on our refrigerator. If you don't feel like I'm the appropriate person, here's a resource, right? And I'm doing it in a passive way that's not, giving you any feeling like I'm putting feelings on you or I'm placing what I feel on you. It's just there for you to know that it's there.
And if I can say one more thing about that too, the reality is there's a history here of how we've helped people who are in suicide crisis. Helped, right? We stick them in a hospital. We remove them from everyone they know and love and the systems and support structures and routines. And that is an incredibly isolating experience. So many adolescents, I think, are very worried that that's exactly what's going to happen to them, sight unseen almost, if they say the out loud part, which is, I'm thinking of suicide. The reality here is the vast majority of people are going to be safe and, in fact, get the skills they need to lead a life worth living out in the community, not in a hospital setting. And so we as a health system have got to get better at that too.
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up this discussion. I want to be mindful of everybody who's taken time from their day, usually during their lunch half hour here, to join us. So Carla, thank you so much. Not just for being a guest here, but for all your excellent work. And I know that there's going to be links to more of your information on the podcast website so that the listeners can access some of that. But thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. This is such a gift. Appreciate it.
That was Carla Allan. For more information about Carla or the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.